Most men spend their lives believing that being single is a temporary condition, a holding pattern, a stage to escape as quickly as possible. They grow up hearing that real fulfillment comes from pairing off, from settling down, from attaching themselves to someone else's life. They're told that solitude is something to survive, that a man alone must be incomplete, immature, or somehow behind. But the truth is far less romantic and far more uncomfortable. For many men, the first time they ever meet their true self is the moment they finally stand alone, not surrounded by noise, not drowning in obligation, not performing for approval, just themselves in the quiet. And it's in that quiet that a man realizes how much of his so-called happiness was actually dependence, on attention, on validation, on being needed. Society sells the illusion that meaning is something given to a man by a partner, when in reality, meaning is something a man must build inside himself, long before he shares it with anyone else. You can see the evidence everywhere. Look closely at the men in your life, the friend who once laughed easily, now measuring every word before he speaks. The co-worker who carries invisible tension in his shoulders because one wrong phrase at home turns into an evening-long argument. The brother who used to have opinions, but now avoids every conversation that might start something. These aren't men living in love. They're men walking on eggshells, trapped in dynamics that slowly erode their sense of self. They're not choosing partnership, they're surviving it. And after years of this, a man wakes up one day and realizes he doesn't recognize himself in the mirror, not because he changed, but because he disappeared. Piece by piece, compromise by compromise, apology by apology. That's why singlehood, for a man who's been drained to the bone, doesn't feel like emptiness. It feels like air entering his lungs for the first time in years. The silence no longer feels harsh. It feels clean. He sits on a couch, not as an exile, but as a king reclaiming his territory. He wakes up to peace instead of tension. He eats when he wants, sleeps when he wants, thinks his own thoughts without censoring them for someone else's comfort. His life stops feeling like a negotiation and starts feeling like ownership. That simple shift, ownership, is what transforms solitude into strength. Because a man who owns his time owns his mind, and a man who owns his mind is dangerous in all the ways that matter. Being single is not the absence of connection. It's the presence of sovereignty. It's the moment a man stops outsourcing his well-being. No more emotional weather reports to read before speaking. No more pretending everything's fine just to maintain stability. No more carrying the invisible emotional load that relationships often demand. The modern man doesn't break down because he is weak. He breaks because he has spent years carrying burdens that were never meant to be his. But in solitude, those burdens fall away, and what remains is clarity, the kind of clarity that can't be faked and can't be found in noise. Most men underestimate how deeply external validation shaped their identity, until it's gone. When no one is watching, when no one is evaluating his choices, a man discovers what he actually wants. Not what he was taught to want, not what someone expected from him, but what his own mind gravitates toward when left alone. That rediscovery is powerful. It turns confusion into direction. It turns hesitation into decisiveness. In solitude, a man doesn't become cold. He becomes whole. He doesn't become selfish. He becomes centered. He doesn't become distant. He becomes disciplined. And here's something most people will never admit. Relationships, for many men, erode discipline. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but slowly and silently. The gym visits decline, the hobbies disappear, the friendships fade, the focus shatters, the mission dims, because emotional labour, even when subtle, is a full-time job. But when a man steps into solitude, discipline comes back like muscle memory. He starts eating clean again, he trains harder, he sleeps deeper, he wakes with sharper intentions. His mind stops scattering across 3 million small obligations and returns to a single powerful trajectory. That focus is why solitude becomes transformation. Without emotional turbulence, a man's productivity skyrockets. Without constant negotiation, his mind becomes still. Without guilt or performance, he can finally sit with his thoughts long enough to understand them. Self-control stops being an effort and starts being a rhythm. He no longer feels the need to justify his decisions or dilute his ambitions. His time becomes valuable in a way it never was before. Not because someone else suddenly respects it, but because he finally does. This shift, this quiet sharpening, is what outsiders misunderstand. They think the single man is hiding from commitment. They think he's lost faith in love. They think he's withdrawn in bitterness, but they don't see the truth. He's rebuilding. He's recalibrating. He's reconnecting with himself in ways that no one else could facilitate. Solitude isn't a retreat. It's a forge. It's where a man becomes the kind of person who can handle pressure, hold boundaries, think clearly, and walk away from anything that threatens his peace. And that level of self-possession is magnetic, not because he tries to attract, but because he no longer needs to. When a man stops needing validation, everything changes. He stops chasing. He stops negotiating. He stops shrinking himself to fit situations beneath him. He stops tolerating disrespect, emotional manipulation, or inconsistent affection. He stops giving his energy to anyone who hasn't earned it. That shift alters his entire presence. His voice gets calmer. His posture gets stronger. His eyes get clearer. He moves with intention because he's no longer pulled in a dozen directions. He's anchored. People feel that difference instantly. Friends treat him with more respect. Colleagues trust his judgment more readily. Women notice his composure because it isn't manufactured. It's internal. He's no longer trying to impress. He's no longer performing. He simply is. And that authenticity, that groundedness, is rare enough in the modern world that it stands out immediately. Men who embrace solitude don't become emotionally closed. They become emotionally selective. They don't hide their hearts. They protect them. They don't reject intimacy. They reject chaos. Because once a man has experienced the peace of being fully aligned with himself, he will never again settle for a relationship that feels like a negotiation. He knows the difference between a partner and a parasite, between love and dependency, between affection and expectation. And ironically, the man who doesn't need a relationship is the one who handles relationships best. He sets boundaries effortlessly because he's not afraid to lose anyone. He communicates clearly because he has nothing to hide. He gives freely because he's giving from abundance, not desperation. He stands firm because he knows that solitude is always an option and not a punishment. This is why single men are often happier than people expect. Not because they hate company, but because they've learned to appreciate silence. Not because they fear connection, but because they refuse to sacrifice their identity for it. Not because they're emotionally unavailable, but because they're emotionally disciplined. A man who has mastered solitude becomes the kind of person who chooses relationships, not for validation, not for escape, not for comfort, but for alignment. And until alignment appears, he's willing to remain alone. That patience is not a burden, it's a superpower. What society calls loneliness is often just peace misunderstood. What society calls isolation is often just a man reclaiming the parts of himself he lost. What society calls emptiness is often the clearing of space for something real. So if you're walking through a season of solitude right now, understand this: nothing is wrong with you. You're not behind. You're not incomplete. You're not failing. You are rebuilding the foundation every strong man needs: clarity, discipline, direction, and self-respect. You are learning to stand without leaning, to breathe without permission, to move without needing approval. And when a man can stand alone, he can stand anywhere. That's the truth most people don't want to admit. A man at peace with himself becomes untouchable. He becomes unshakable. He becomes someone who doesn't follow the world, he leads his own. And the world respects him for it, even if it doesn't understand him, because in a culture addicted to noise, the man who walks in silence becomes unforgettable.